welcome everybody to the How Good Innovation Online series. I'm Ethan Soloviev, Chief Innovation Officer at How Good. These talks focus on biodiversity, regenerative agriculture, and planetary health. I think this is the 5th we've done out of a series of about 20 different participants, thought leaders from around the world. Today we're focusing on regenerative agriculture and the hashtag Regenerative Dairy that Tina's gonna lay out for us. I'll give you just a brief little agenda structure for our time today, and then pass it over to Tina for an intro. So our speaker is Tina Owens, the Senior Director of Agriculture and Impact at Danone North America, talking about towards regenerative dairy. So she and I will have a conversation for 30-35 minutes or so. We'll do some interactive community breakouts where you'll get to connect with other folks who are here, talk a little bit about what you heard, ask some questions, and then we'll come back together before the top of the hour for Q&A, and we'll end promptly at the top of the hour. I think that's it. Welcome everyone. Welcome Tina. Do you want to introduce yourself and, I don't know, say hello and any way you want to get us started?
Well, first I'd like to say thank you to you, Ethan. It's always a pleasure to be able to have these conversations with you. I know you and I show up in some of the same spaces in the industry from time to time, and it's fun to be able to do this even though we're all still kind of in our separate quarantined areas. So I appreciate the timeliness of this chat. And my role as Senior Director of Food and Agricultural Impact at Danone North America is about addressing the future of how you create a pathway for farms to onboard into regenerative agriculture. And I'm part of our public affairs team. I am working across the industry to create unique solutions that farmers may not otherwise be able to create themselves. So that could include opening doors on grants, on funding, helping address industry needs around definitions and working groups, because really, the regenerative movement is nothing if we don't all actually come together with a sense of community on the impact that we can all collectively have. And I consider myself very much a leader within that role, and expecting myself to act as leadership within that role of bringing the industry folks together for impact. So thanks again for the opportunity today.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. And regenerative agriculture is hot. It's moving. It's happening right now. Regenerative dairy is a wing of regenerative agriculture that hasn't really, I don't know, people are just getting to it, starting to think about it. And so I think it's really amazing what you're doing, the way you're not just saying, well, we've got it all figured out, it's done, here it is, but like, let's work as a community to move this forward and learn the things that we don't know yet. I think it's awesome. Can you, just to get us started, give us a bit of a sense of scale for Danone, and how many farmers do you work with? Are there, how many acres are involved? Is there, you know, how many gallons or pounds of milk are you buying? Just give us a bit of a sense of scale for North America.
Yeah, so Danone North America is a $6 billion company. We're the world's largest B Corp, which is a very unique thing about who we are within the CPG world overall. And we have some brands that you may not even realize are part of our company. And I find this a lot, that you say Danone North America and people aren't quite sure what we mean. But when you talk about our brands like Horizon, International Delight, Activia, Danone, some of these brands may be in your refrigerator right now, and brands that you've eaten for the better part of your life. And so we try to be the big, good food company, and have targets around our mission of One Planet, One Health, and bringing health through food to as many people as possible. And through that, on our milk platform specifically, we work with over 770 family farms. Danone's very unique in the fact that we have direct relationships with those farmers, and Ethan, I know we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. You know, we have soil health programs that work through those farms and that span multiple states, and you know, over 1 billion pounds of milk, and you know, lots of details that we can get into there on scale, but hopefully that helps set the stage for who we are and how we show up.
That's great. And so I'm gonna, what is regenerative dairy? Or maybe before that, like, how do you think about regenerative agriculture? People have different approaches, viewpoints. Some say you have to check off these boxes and not use these chemicals. Some say it's all about carbon in the soil. Some are saying, well, it's much more holistic than that. How do you think about, and I don't like to define things. So it's more like, what's your perspective? How are you moving on regenerative agriculture? And then maybe if you can take that into what does that mean in the particular context of dairy?
Yeah, so we have a multifaceted team within Danone North America and globally that are working on bringing regenerative agriculture to life, and I play a small role within that larger team. And for us, our global definition is that regenerative agriculture is a set of farming practices that protect soils, water, and biodiversity and respect animal welfare. So, going beyond the field, as you intimated, right? Some people talk about it being just specifically soil. We're looking to restore ecosystems. And even the way that I show up with my role in regenerative finance, that is an ecosystem that needs regeneration. And there's lots of examples that I could share of different parts of the food system that we are using our leverage and our scale in order to develop solutions that we hope others within the industry will follow, because it does take that holistic approach of us all working together on it.
Yeah, so within dairy, I mean, dairy is it's a fascinating industry. And so I think what I heard you say is that to talk about regenerative in dairy, it doesn't just mean, yeah, we're adding carbon to the soil, though that's a really important part. It doesn't just mean we're looking to increase biodiversity or water holding capacity. You're saying, wait a minute, dairy's an industry, and maybe we even need to look at the economic, the financial, the farmer profitability aspects of that if we're really going to think in a holistic way about regeneration. Does that sound right?
Yes. Yes, that was about 8 yeses that I could have given in response to what you just said. So, it all comes down to the different values with which we even approach our farmer network. And so I'll give a little bit about our cost plus model, because that actually enables a lot of the other work that you're talking about with the full system integrated view on regenerative. Around 2011, 2012, Danone actually piloted a program called Cost Plus Model with a very large family-owned dairy. And what Cost Plus means is that the cost of the dairy production is covered plus a margin. And the nature of these is 5-year contracts, 100% of the volume coming from those farms. And we have now, roughly a dozen or so farms that are part of this program that is about 40% of our non-organic milk spend. And those farms are already in a different mind space with us, because they are not worried about how they're going to stay in business next week, next month, next generation. We've created a sense of continuity where they understand what the rules are. They are happy to show up and play with us in this space. It's complete transparency between the two companies. And the fact that we have this solid supply chain base to work off of has helped enable really quick moves around non-GMO project verification and domestic sourcing of non-GMO grains. But it also, I mentioned we started in 2011, 2012. In 2016 through 2018, when we started our Danone Pledge, that ended up becoming an additional soil health program commitment of $6 million over 5 years, those farms were the first ones we went to. And they were all in with us because of the thought leadership space that they're able to occupy. And actually, EcoPractices, our third-party verifier that works with us on our soil health program in the 26,000 acres that has now become almost 75,000 acres, they were brought to us by that first cost plus model farm. So, even the ecosystem there itself of the farms providing us with information and third parties that can help us move really big levers, and then having a completely different way that we partner with those dairies and their impact in their local communities allows us to take on really big programs like what we're doing in regenerative agriculture and our soil health program.
Okay, so this I just want to slow it down and point out how amazing this is, because we talked on a previous, I think it was a biodiversity conversation, about contracts and about longer term contracts. And I was saying this is a kind of like, it looks small or seems small when you first think about it, but it's actually huge. Longer term buying contracts between manufacturers and producers enable a huge amount of creativity, trust, experimentation. I think from my position as a farmer, I grow chestnut trees, I grow apple trees. And when I plant a chestnut tree, it takes literally 5 years before I'm even going to see a nut. And so for me to make that investment in something that will have huge long-term carbon storage in the soil, in the biomass, for me to even do that, I need to know, is there even going to be a market for this? And so the prospect of having a longer term buying contract is huge in perennial agriculture. And I forget who we were talking to last time, but somebody asked, is that happening? And I basically said, no, I mean, if you can get a 1 year or 2 year contract for your crops, for your fruit, for whatever, that's huge. And what you just said is you're doing 5-year contracts, and it's based on an actual mutual understanding of each other's finances. So
Yes.
am I right that there's some aspect of like open books that need to take place so that you can figure out what the cost is and then go above it?
Yes, so Axel Lundstrom, who leads our farmer partnerships team and has a couple dozen people reporting into him that own these farmer relationships, he'll talk about the difference in how we approach this, and that there's actually a 1-year dating period, is what he calls it. So we spend a year with that open dialogue, the books opening, and really feeling each other out, because if you're not able to be 100% transparent in that year, then how are we able to take on the cost of your operating cost, your overhead, your capital investment, et cetera. And, what really is the strength of this program is the supply chain stability it provides for us. And, if you look at the dairy commoditized cost, you can see that going back to 2013, it's not even covered the cost of production. So we have better part of a decade now of most of the dairy industry struggling hand to mouth, not knowing where their next paycheck is going to come from, or not knowing what type of prices they can count on, and seeing really depressed prices within the market. Our farmers that were able to get into this program, and as I said, it's roughly 40% of our conventional milk. It is such a unique space that worry is gone. It's a completely different way of looking at it, and it allows us to cost optimize things across the network, where you might not normally have a network of farms that are working with each other on cost reduction and finding unique ways of sharing best practices with each other. So that's really great. But, going back to what you were saying about carving out volume, I've found that not only ourselves, but other big CPGs that are trying to tackle some of these really big, hairy questions within our supply chain, one of the first things that they're doing is decommoditizing it. So you'll see them peel off a piece of the supply chain, get that relationship going with the growers, with the dairies, et cetera, in order to actually have the impact that they want. And it's because the commoditized system actually keeps you from being able to see what your true impact is on the environment. And this is key, not only because we have the cost plus model program, but we also, around 2017, 2018, moved away from a co-op model as well, where we went direct to those 700 plus farms, as opposed to having big co-op entities in the middle, where it was more of a black box, right? We didn't have the transparency in what was happening with our supply chain. So there's just multiple levers that had to be pulled here in order to set us up for the success that we have today. And each program in itself is unique to the industry, unique to Danone North America, worth talking about on its own, but then sets up the regenerative conversation that you and I want to have on, the details of how we're going behind the scenes with these farmers to truly drive for change.
Okay, and so just two little things to point at there, and then a question that comes up. One is my perspective on regenerative and what regenerative agriculture is requires that each entity that's seeking regenerative agriculture, that would be each farm, that would be each business, has its own unique approach that expresses like who the company is and how the company works, who the farmer is, how their land works, and seeks to express that uniquely. So, you're doing this in the way that nobody else is, which is a really useful indicator and step towards regenerative from my perspective. The question then that comes up is like, how on earth did you get farmers to open their books? I know I'm a farmer. I don't show anyone my books. I know other farmers, they don't even have books, which is one of the challenges, in some cases. So like what in that dating period, how do you actually make that value proposition of being so open in an industry that is often agriculture, doesn't want to share what's in there? How are you able to do that? And what's the value that the farmers are seeing? And then you can sort of translate that towards how did you use that to head into regeneration with these farmers?
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's really one thread that goes through all of those questions that I think bears talking about very deliberately, which is McCarty Family Farms. And you can Google McCarty Family Farms. You'll be able to go to their website. You'll be able to see that they have an affiliation with Danone North America. And they're the ones that first entered into the cost plus model contract with us. And so it took a family of dairy innovators to work with us on the first iteration, right? And they were in a critical supply shed for us, a critical watershed for plants with products that are critical to our supply, and really out of the box thinking from our executives within Danone to take this on and then be willing to expand it to additional farms. And so, like anything with change, you get those people that are excited to be first adopters, that actually want to blaze a trail, right? And then you get people who sit and watch and see how those trailblazers do and whether it goes well or whether there's, pitfalls that were unforeseen. And so with that relationship, we were able to show we were serious and recruit other farmers in and show that it worked and that it was viable. And the relationship with McCarty is so longstanding that we're talking about even moving beyond 5-year contracts to longer relationship contracts. That's how much stability we're looking to provide for the farmers that have entered into this two-way transparency conversation with us and are really a big part of who we are, how we talk about ourselves, and how we talk about our strategies internally.
And then how does that, being able to see into books both ways, how does that translate to some of the regen ag innovations that you're seeking with those farmers, the different practices? Are you paying them to plant trees, or how is that actually working, that you're exploring regenerative principles and agriculture with these farms in the program?
Yeah, as I touched on earlier, McCarty Farms was actually the one that brought us Eco Practices, which ended up becoming our third-party verifier and our partner that we announced around our soil health program in 2018. And so because those first 26,000 acres were with farms where we had the cost plus model program in place, there are already enough unique levers where we're covering the cost essentially as a pass-through, right? So if the cost is occurring on the farm, then it's getting passed through to us already by virtue of the system. What we then had to do was account for the growers in their network that feed into that dairy, right? Because they're not growing all of that feed on site. And so where Danone is playing in this is we're actually paying for Eco Practices' entire platform as it relates to the 75,000 acres now that we have enrolled in the soil health program. And so the farms that are in this, it's a wonderful program. Eco Practices goes in and looks at everything from satellite data to the notes in the front of the farmer's pocket to their My John Deere, any information that they're able to gather to create a holistic view of what's occurring on that farm. And then they give what's called a Sustainable Continuous Improvement Plan, or a SCIP plan, to the farms that gives them the top 4 to 6 practices that they can do for their region, for the crops they grow, for their soil type, et cetera, as well as actually doing soil sampling, to help them understand where they're at in the system and as it relates to regenerative agriculture practices, and have us an aggregate view of who's doing tillage, no tillage, crop rotation, cover cropping, which varieties they're using. I could go on, water inputs, et cetera. And then what we're doing is once the farmer has that information, and we spent 2 years baselining with the farms that we recruited in, now we're helping move the needle on those 4 to 6 practices. Which ones do they want to take on? How can we open doors on funding that will help them make that transition? And then the farms themselves get to choose which of those practices they're interested in moving forward. And then, as part of that, I know it's a bit more detailed than you asked for in this question, but as part of helping them pay for that, we actually received a conservation innovation grant last year in conjunction with a partnership with National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, where we're using grant money as well as our own money to help farmers adopt those practices. And this year in our ag sourcing team that works directly with the farms, this is the big heavy lift they're doing this year, which is taking that grant money and actually pushing it through the farms to the places where the farmers are welcoming the help. That helps get that needle turning on additional acres that are covered in cover crops, or maybe they planted 6 species and we want them to try 15 species in that cover crop, to encourage the innovation that it takes, the open mindset, and take a big edge off of the risk that the farmer has, while also showing an outcome in 2022 for the NRCS grant of what impact we had on the return on investment and farmer economics. So that's where I don't like calling it a carrot, but that's where the carrot is for the farm community overall, even outside our network. If we can show growers that adopting these practices puts them in a better position of resilience for both climate and economic shocks, both of which we know are coming and which we're experiencing at this very moment, Then you create a self-perpetuating cycle where they understand why it's in their best interest to do so, whether or not we're able to continue at this level of incentive, right? Because this is a big, heavy lift with a lot of resources behind it. We want to get those, again, like the cost plus model with the soil health program, you want to get farmers that are out ahead, have done enough of the practices, can show the outcome, you have data to back it up, you can create the whole story, you can create a white paper that's backed by the NRCS to show not only your own footprint of 700 plus farmers, why this is good, but the industry at large, because dairy has a lot of fingers pointed at it right now, right?
I mean, that's the real, here's where we start hitting a bit of a regenerative effect and rippling outwards, right?
Yeah.
The practices themselves, some, people might argue one way or the other about are they themselves regenerative or not, but when you're seeing you're actually measuring outcomes that have to do with things that honestly, most farmers care a huge amount about, resilience, supply chain stability, and economic profitability. If you can show that you're doing that alongside environmental, ecological improvements, that's a big unlock. Amazing. So go ahead.
Actually, having the conversations with the farmers outside of our cost plus model farmers, you actually want to have the conversation about what's in it for them, as opposed to the climate conversation. That can be polarizing for some people along political lines, frankly. And what you don't want is to come to them with what your needs are. It's actually best to come to them with how this can help them meet their long-term needs for next year, next decade, next generation viability of their farms.
Right, yeah. We worked on this in the last regenerative agriculture working group, which is sort of the deeper level for industry professionals of this Regen series, where we were looking at how do you approach not saying, well, regenerative is the best thing ever and you should all be doing it, but saying, what's interesting to you? What do you care about? Where do you think you are currently and where do you want to go? If you're interested in greater profitability, well, you don't have to do this stuff, but here's these other farms that we've worked with in the white paper that you can see for, like, that is what will move people when they're invited to take their own steps towards what they want, as opposed to, from my perspective, coming in top down with the certifications and saying, well, you all have to be regenerative now. So, I mean, this is so awesome to hear about the cost plus model on the conventional side. Also within Danone North America's portfolio is Horizon Organic. And we would have all been together in person at Expo West to hear this, but Horizon made a pretty amazing announcement then. And so, yeah, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about that, and also sort of the context, what it means for this industry and beyond. And it's different than what you're talking about with cost plus, and the strategy is different. So yeah, just help us see and understand more of that.
Yeah, and you're taking me back to one of the most disappointing professional days in my career so far, that we were not able to have the climate day ahead of Expo West and actually be in the room and feel the energy of this type of announcement being made. But Horizon Organic committed in March to become the first carbon positive dairy brand by 2025. So I'll explain in a moment what carbon positive means, but the ambition is to pioneer a new type of organic dairy company that revitalizes the air we breathe, the animals we cherish, the farmers we support, and the soil beneath our feet. All of which are systems that need to be regenerated, right? And let's talk for a moment about what carbon positive means, because for those that are in the technical side of the carbon world, they'll say, but to draw down carbon and to sequester it is actually carbon negative because you're removing carbon from the air. And what we're talking about is going to carbon neutral and then beyond. And the reason we called it carbon positive is because we wanted to educate consumers about the positive impact that this program will have on ecosystems, on farmers, on dairy at large. And because Horizon Organic is the largest organic milk brand in the world, this is meaningful. Not only that, we gave ourselves a very short timeline of 2025 to actually do this. And not only that, it's unlike some other operations, it's not just our employee greenhouse gas emissions or our manufacturing footprint or the consumer footprint, et cetera. It's literally all the way back to the seed in the field that grew the crop, that went through the dairy, that went through our facility, that then ends up on a refrigerated truck, that ends up in your refrigerator as a consumer. It's the entire breadth of our greenhouse gas footprint, which is massive. And so obviously we're not going to be able to reduce down to zero. There is no way to reduce to zero emissions, but we are working on significant reductions throughout the entire supply chain. Most of this, though, has got to occur at the farm, either in the field or for the dairy. And then we'll seek to use offsets to supplement where we're not able to create reductions. So this is a significant commitment by the brand and significant leadership that we want to create, both within the organic industry on the expectations around dairy, and then with dairy at large.
You know, relatively few brands that I've seen in the industry have made such a commitment. You know, there's some others that have achieved a carbon neutral certification or have said, you know, we're net zero through similar strategies of, okay, I can think of Wassa right now for some reason. They, you know, reduced what they could in their wheat production, et cetera, and then used offsets to get to zero. But it's pretty different to say, oh no, we're going beyond that. We're actually going to, you know, push it so far that overall we're capturing carbon. Do you think that the soil can be part of that on your dairy farms, on the farms that supply Horizon Organic with milk?
It's a great question. So we started off with 11,000 acres of our soil health program. So of that 75,000 acres that we've got enrolled currently, 11,000 of it is Horizon Organic, representing just over 13 million gallons of milk, and 7 dairies, 5 states, 11,000 acres. And this is one pillar of this. Obviously, we have to do a life cycle assessment, which has been completed, but also helps us understand, right, the manufacturing footprint, the distribution, transportation footprint, et cetera. And then within those dairies where we've completed the life cycle assessment and some additional assessments beyond the soil health program, how do we engage those farms and incentivize them to adopt things like solar, wind, breeding techniques, and really look under every rock, question everywhere that the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, related to the dairy, related to the field, related to the animal, and find new ways of partnering with entities, states, you know, like-minded foundations, et cetera, that will help us incentivize farmers to adopt those individual practices that culminate in a greatly reduced footprint for dairy. And then beyond that, we do need to purchase offsets, but we're looking very closely at how to create domestically based offsets that align with the communities in which we do business, the farms with which we already have contracts, which there's over 660 contracts that we have directly with Horizon Organic Farms, all the way down to 4 cows on an Amish dairy, all the way up through, you know, just over 1,000 on the largest. And, you know, so we have a lot of work to do and not a whole lot of time to do it. We're very actively working on this with a very large team within Danone North America, feeding into the Horizon brand.
And so what is what kind of financial creativity, or what are you looking at for funding innovation or helping farmers innovate? Like how, I understand it from the cost plus model, you're doing something different here. What's the financial approach?
So we have, as I mentioned, the Conservation Innovation Grant, the $3 million, although that's meant to be over the full soil health program. But we also have a unique partnership with Replant Capital, which is a new capital model with founders that came out of the B Corp community. So obviously very values aligned with us as the world's largest B Corp. And what they're doing is working on breaking the financial system and remaking it in a way that puts farmer profitability at the center. And so they're working with individuals of high net worth, foundations and other entities to aggregate funding that people are looking to actively put into solutions. And so, you know, you have a lot of investment money that has typically been in things that ultimately led to deforestation or, you know, other climate crises that we're in now. Those investors are looking to pivot into things that are actually creating a solution. And so Replant helps us bundle some of those activist investors together to create a $20 million fund that our farms can access for capital that they need to help a conversion. And then beyond that, within Horizon specifically, we're looking at, you know, are there state tax incentives? Are there grants? You know, my role, I'm looking at tax grants, philanthropic, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the third. I think I already mentioned it actually though. But I'm looking at 3 different ways that we can bring in funding in order to take the edge off both what we need to bring to the table, but also what the farmer needs to put on the table, so that that ROI for the farmer is so compelling that they would feel like it was that they would feel like it was a poor decision not to go through with it, right? That we want it to be so easy, so tangible, so cost effective, that people are actually clamoring to sign up, as opposed to the feeling of it being forced on them, like a certification. You mentioned that example earlier. And we also have committed $1.5 million a year starting in 2021 and going through 2030, so 10 years of grants and loans of our own funding that will go towards those investments, specifically within the Horizon footprint. And so that's also a completely different way that we're showing up. And when you bundle all of those things together, it can create a really unique space. We're also inviting people that want to see the same outcomes that we have in those communities, who might already be looking to invest in this type of stuff, to bundle with us so that their impact goes farther. And in this way, it gets back to the communal approach that we need to have on regenerative, that the more of us that are working together, the more of us that are pulling in the same direction, the larger the impact we can have. We're counting on that.
Amazing. And so that 1.5 million a year can go to any of those different improvements that you talked about, that you can see through a full life cycle assessment. So you may not have the specific figures of this, but you'd be able to understand, like, what's the carbon footprint per gallon of milk, and then all the different things that contribute to that. And then the grants and the loans will go out to basically target with materiality, or maybe, I don't know, maybe this is somehow connected to science-based targets of, like, where should you actually be focusing on these farms within the overall footprint to be making the change. Is that right?
Yes, so I'm going to answer kind of in reverse order of how you set that up. So first of all, Danone is part of Science-Based Targets, Danone Corporate. And so those are set actually at our corporate parent company level in Paris. And, we're reworking those after the IPCC report of, I think it was last fall, came out, and they said that the target needed to be 1.5 degrees Celsius in overall climate impact versus 2 degrees they had previously said. And so we're reworking those now as it comes from the science-based targets. But within that, over 50% of our greenhouse gas footprint globally comes from agriculture. And so even if we were to do all the reductions possible on our manufacturing footprint and our employee footprint and our office footprint, et cetera, if we are not working on scope 3 emissions, and our suppliers, and a lot of our suppliers lead into agriculture and dairy, we know is especially intensive around greenhouse gas emissions, we have to address this, or we actually won't meet our public goals that we've set. So we've got a 30% greenhouse gas reduction target by 2030 overall as a global company, and then by 100% by 2050. And so you mentioned the carbon footprint of a gallon of milk. Part of determining our greenhouse gas emissions, the life cycle assessment of our full business, and the science-based targets was to actually map out the carbon footprint of a gallon of milk. And that's actually done at a global level for our company. And then they're able to compare within regions and look for best practices within certain regions that they can translate to others. And there's a team at the global level that has that work and mandate.
Let me just ask one brief one that's coming in from the chat there, which is about policy. And are there policy levels on the, local level, on the federal level? Where do you see, of course, there's lots of policy opportunities. Where do you see real niches or sort of nodal points that you think would support what you're doing and also the larger work on regenerative?
Yeah, Chris Adamo, our VP of Government Affairs, would be so tickled that you asked that question, Ethan. So he actually had me testify in front of the Congressional Committee on Climate Crisis last October, specific to policy. So he's leading these conversations in DC. So let's put it that way. At the national level, we are having absolutely the conversation and have been vocal about it and been willing to go out there in the open and make these statements about how we think the system needs to change. Behind that, we're also part of the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance that works with Unilever, Mars, and Nestle to align specifically on that policy that we believe is in the general good of the food system and of ecosystems and of the greater good within the U.S. As it relates to how the food system interacts with it. So on policy, yes, we're working at a state level. We actually, through our partnership with National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, are working with individual states on how they're interacting with our farms and trying to open doors that through the state cons or NRCS that our individual farmers wouldn't be able to open. And I could go on here, but I know you want to pivot to that other conversation. So I'll actually stop there. But let's see if anything comes back up in the questions.
Sounds like lots of policy opportunities at many levels. And Chris Adama, who's working on it, sees the whole picture. So
yes, he does.
Maybe we can get him on sometime to talk about regen ag and policy. Actually, we might do that, because I think we might do a little panel with a couple of the companies who are working at a scale that they do work on policy to see the different approaches. So there was a question from Marcella about, 40% of the milk is sourced this way. When's it going to be 100%? So Tina.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And the answer is that we are still a brand that has to price ourselves according to the shelf set at the grocery store. And we're also a publicly traded company. And so there's a balance that we have to strike. While we would love to do more than 40% of our conventional volume, that helps us reduce volatility, especially in times like now, where we are paying more than the cost of the commoditized cost of milk. So our farmers are getting a guaranteed profit at a time when most are actually losing a considerable amount of funding. But if we went all in on that, we would actually not necessarily be able to have a competitive milk price, which would lead to different prices for consumers. And so we've chosen to go for the highest amount we can have in supply chain continuity balance, while bringing the values through that we about in people, planet, and profit as the world's largest B Corp. So it's representative. We would love to do more. Actually, Ethan, my question would be, why hasn't the rest of the industry started to adopt some of these models and the transparency that it brings? Seeing my friend Cesare with a little woohoo there. Yes, the fight that we're both fighting, sister, right? That we would like what we're doing here to be a case study for other businesses on ways to make a bigger impact within their supply chain. And again, go back to many need to start bringing a different approach in, and we're doing what we can with what we can.
Awesome. And so then kind of related, there's a question about the cost plus model. It says, welcomed by farmers when costs are going up, but is it, when costs decrease, is it hard to retain the farmers? How do you deal with that? How have you dealt with that in North America?
Ethan, if you got a job where you were offered to make a smashing profit in 1 year, but for the other 6 or 7 years, you knew you were going to have a tremendous loss, so much so that you didn't know how you were going to stay in business. Or you were offered a path where you had steady income that you could count on year for at least 5 years. Which one do you think you would choose? Which one would the folks on the phone choose, right? Would you choose the feast or famine, or would you choose the, hey, I know what I can count on, I know what I can do in this model, I know my needs are covered, and by the way, I can plan more for the next generation in the future based on this model than the one where it's more hand to mouth and with the swings of the market?
Well, okay. Well, I guess it depends on how old I am and how risky I'm feeling. But yeah, no, great. I think that's excellent. There's also a question here, more on the LCA side from Connie, that's about basically how complex LCAs are and how there's discrepancies, in systems boundaries, in what's being measured and counted where. I don't know if you wanted to add anything from Danone perspective. I can also kind of speak to a little bit just on the science side of it.
Yeah, I just want to say that Deanna Bratter, who leads our sustainable development team, is actually the thought leader for this in our space. And I don't really feel comfortable taking the question, but if you have some insights to add, I think you should.
Yeah. So I would just say LCA science, life cycle assessment science, is still growing and improving, and we don't have the granularity that we want. This is part of what How Good does, is it tracks life cycle assessments that have been done all over the world. For greenhouse gas emissions, for water use, for everything. And one of the things that's changing really quickly right now in life cycle assessment, or over the last 10 years, we've been adding more aspects of the system. So it used to be that the system boundary was really small. We talked about this a bit in our last biodiversity call. But now the system is more whole and more unified amongst the different studies that are happening, which is leading to at least a little better honing in on results. The other thing that is starting, but we still have a ways to go, is that most life cycle assessment studies do not consider soil carbon sequestration. So they're missing this huge opportunity on the regen side of measuring and tracking the actual good that can happen. And so that when that starts to get added in, you see really big swings. So just an example from beef, not from dairy, is the recent White Oak Pastures study on regenerative agriculture that showed, you know, the everything else, conventional, even organic, was 28, 30 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions per kilogram of beef. This one ended up at minus, you know, 5 kilograms. And that's because they did a good job calculating in soil carbon. So that is coming. And I think basically the best approach, I don't know what Danone is doing specifically, but you just have to follow the science and follow the journals that are coming out and use more recent studies to be making decisions on in general, as opposed to some of the ones that left things out a little further back. So that's my thought.
Yeah, and I just want to share, we're using the Carbon Trust to validate what we're doing on the Horizon Organic commitment, just so that's clear.
We have a couple of questions here. I don't know, Keith, do you want to pop off mute and ask this question?
Thanks, Tina, for taking the time. I just wanted to talk more about how you guys are interacting with the ecosystem markets and how that works into your cost plus model, because essentially you guys are applying that to your scope 3, but just want to kind of understand how that a grower potentially could go then sell that service, that carbon credit or water quality credit, should it come to fruition one day on a market. So, and thanks for the time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And actually, you've entered into one of the great controversies of the carbon world right now, just so you know with that question. I will say we are part of the Noble Ecosystem Services Market Consortium within the US. And so we are at the table with the players that are having the discussion about how we value carbon credits within agriculture. And you know, we were one of the founding members of that as well. We know we can create reductions within the farms. The farms themselves own the ecosystem credits from that. And there's a question around double accounting if you create the reduction and then also turn around and buy the credit. And so this is one of those where the consensus is still out, and it's not a North American conversation. It's actually a global conversation. It's well beyond Danone. Many thought leaders in this space that need to help us decide how we actually approach this in order to ensure that our farmers get the maximum amount of value that they have in those ecosystem services that they're creating. And there's a lot more attention being deliberately paid by the industry to this for the farms because it's looked at as an additional source of revenue. So for those farms that aren't part of a model like ours, where we're paying for the third party to come in and give them the information, we're opening doors on funding, we're making sure they have capital, some of the stuff we're outright just paying for. For those outside the model, how do we create a system that's part of the greater good, where farmers who don't even have a partnership with a big CPG could also get credit and revenue from that type of work? And it's probably going to be 12 to 24 months before the industry answers that question. And Ethan, I don't know, I know you follow this conversation. If you have anything to add that I didn't cover, I think you should.
What I like about this right now is that there's a diversity of approaches happening in the ecosystem payment for ecosystem service arena. I like that everyone hasn't clamped down and only done the ESMC. I like that there's little blockchain startups like Nori that are trying stuff out. You know, I think it's really interesting the creativity that's showing up around it. Payment for ecosystem services has sort of risen and fallen over the last decade a couple times. You know, carbon markets crashed and failed at one point completely. So I think farmers know that, see that, and are a little wary of it, but are looking forward to and interested in when they can be compensated for the excellent work that they're doing on their farms. I am still, at least for myself on my farm and the other farms that I manage, I'm not building a business model around payment for ecosystem services. I think it's premature to do that unless you have the sort of mega scale that some of the larger, you know, Kyoto Protocol projects or other things have done. I think in farming, you still need to have good business fundamentals and a product that sells and a stable buyer for it. And so at least for now, and 12 to 24 months sounds great. I think it's even going to be a little longer before there's, you know, stability in the payment for ecosystem services side. Okay, I'm going to go over to Christina for a cool question that she had. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. This has been a super interesting chat. So my question is maybe partially answered by the work on the ecosystem service marketplace consortium, but from what I've seen, so much of the conversation in regenerative ag is this like really exciting potential for soil carbon sequestration. And now that's being hotly contested. You have kind of even major nonprofit and think tanks like WRI who are saying, let's pump the brakes, right? And they're kind of saying, oh, maybe we need so many different approaches, but even things like intensification in order to achieve this like sustainable food future. So I'm wondering about kind of the conversations you've had around that. Like what is there reframing that needs to be done around the climate potential of regenerative ag, and how do we kind of push the conversation to talk about the more of the holistic benefits of regenerative ag? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Christina, thanks for the question. This is actually, you're right, hotly contested at the moment, a very big debate. And I think the reason for that is that you have companies like us and certainly many others that I could name that have made commitments around what we're going to do around greenhouse gas emissions and carbon reduction using regenerative agriculture, right? Where I think that let's call them gaps, are being called out by some of these entities that are active thought leaders in the food space and in the broader, broader industry spaces, including greenhouse gas and climate. Our response in the moment would be, that agriculture is only one piece of many that need to be on the plate, and so. We're talking about agriculture as though it can overcompensate for things that are happening within the fossil fuel industry, and that if you're buying carbon credits, does that then give you license to kind of, do whatever you want as long as you can afford to always go back and buy the credit? And are people getting an easy Band-Aid, an easy out? It's also not necessarily taking into account what we need to do with the ocean, what we need to do with forests. And I know Ethan's very fond of talking about the agroforestry side of it as well. Agriculture is one piece of the solution. Companies like us that have over 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions in our Scope 3 farming emissions are going to have to continue down this route of reduction and sequestration. But to the larger point, more pieces will need to be brought to the table when you look at it from a policy level, when you look at larger actors, when you look at the potential for excusing behavior that actually needs to be corrected by other industries, such as the fossil fuel industry. And then there's also some climate science debate around how much carbon can be sequestered, the permanence of that carbon, how deep you need to go in order to measure that carbon. We've been talking with some of the scientists that had the most recent research on that and research that's even yet to be published. And we feel that we're in the right place for us. We can't speak for other entities, but we know what we're doing. We know who we're working with. We know what their credibility is, and we know that we're being validated by third parties like Carbon Trust, by eco practices. When the program started off by Cornell and the Ohio State University, we've not gone and done this in a silo. We've brought in the thought leadership. We're needed at every point along the way. But I appreciate the question so much because it really is going to be an ongoing debate. Just like the ecosystem credits for farmers, this is all going to be hotly contested for at least the next couple of years.
And I think it goes back to the point you started with, Tina, which is this needs to be an ecosystem, a community that is working together to moving it forward. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on regenerative agriculture, regenerative dairy. I'm just going to briefly put up the upcoming sessions that are going to happen. We've got something from the World Economic Forum. We're going to hear from Chef Pierre Thom on crop commercialization and biodiversity. If you want to geek out on agroforestry, Eric Tonsmeyer is going to be amazing. That's going to be an awesome talk that should not be missed. And then we'll look at the fiber side of animal and crop agriculture with Rebecca Burgess from Fibershed. Hope you'll join us for that. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Tina. Great to have you. Look forward to seeing you all again.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.